It's wonderful to have this opportunity, as I have opportunities periodically to address those who have concerns or who participate in the healthcare industry. And it is, unfortunately, an industry. And really what we are about is trying to reclaim it as a ministry and to help maintain the fact that it is because we are lovers of Christ that drives our work in this whole field. Pope Benedict this year, in his letter announcing the World Day for the Sick in February, he wrote that the Holy Father, his predecessor John Paul II, wanted Our Lady of Lourdes feast day to become a suitable occasion to reflect upon the mysteries and above all to make our communities and civil society more sensitive to our sick brothers and sisters. He wrote, "If every man is our brother, much more must the sick, the suffering, and those in need of care be at the center of our attention, so that none of them feels forgotten or emarginated. Indeed," he writes, quoting Spe Salvi, "the true measure of humanity is essentially determined in relationship to suffering and to the sufferer. This holds true both for the individual and for society. A society unable to accept its suffering members and incapable of helping to share their suffering and to bear it inwardly through compassion," and he hyphenates that word in the encyclical, to really make sure that its root is received, to be in suffering with someone else. That's what compassion is. Any society unable to accept its suffering members and incapable of helping to share their suffering and to bear it inwardly through compassion is a cruel and inhumane society. Now, we would like to think of ourselves in the United States as being anything but a cruel and inhumane society. But if we are not men and women of compassion, then even though we might be providing for all that people need, we might still, at heart, and I propose that we might be a cruel and inhumane society. The Catholic Church certainly needs to have a substantial place at the table in the discussion about health care in the United States. And I propose to you that I'm going to use as the outline for my remarks the Holy Father's statement on the Feast of Our Lady of Lourdes. The Church brings a unique and necessary perspective to the healthcare debate, which is really different from that of the other participants in the debate. First, the Church brings an eternal perspective to the debate. As people of faith, we know that the protection of this human body is not our ultimate goal, and that its eventual demise is not the end. That alone changes how we view sickness and suffering. Unlike the television ads which would boast, when you have your health, you have everything, we would more likely attest, when you have your faith, you have everything. For us then, health, while certainly linked to happiness and ultimate salvation, guarantees neither. Yet there is this illusion in our country somehow that if we have our health, then all other things will be in line. But the reality is that there is an inner sickness which people suffer, which is often also the cause of an exterior sickness. But it's a spiritual sickness that our country suffers from. We need to be aware of that. We understand that excessive concern for our bodies is not something which Jesus preached. Quite the opposite. Jesus used physical healing as a means of proclaiming the kingdom, but his goal was not to cure everyone. In fact, if you read, he did not eliminate a single disease, and he could well have done so. But he didn't. But what he did do was add a level of meaning to whatever suffering people attest or suffer. He rather came to give those who suffer greater confidence in Him who can heal both body and soul. It's a different ministry. It's a different approach to healthcare. He came to give a fuller form of life, a deeper type of life. He came to give us life itself, eternal life. An excessive focus on physical life and well-being, as great as these goods are, causes us to run the risk of forgetting what really matters. How often have you heard patients say their sickness was a great blessing because it helped them reclaim the true meaning of life? How often that happens. Second, the church brings a perspective on suffering, which is almost entirely lacking in any of the healthcare debates. Our culture sees suffering as an absolute evil to be avoided and eliminated at any cost. Not only suffering, but inconvenience, hardship, and distress now fall under the realm of medicine. The trend in our society is to seek a medicinal or medication-based solution for a variety of personal trials, some of which could be alleviated by diet, exercise, self-discipline, or simply chastity. Understanding that suffering can be linked to the redemptive suffering of Christ gives it a meaning which is entirely lacking in a purely secular view. Without the eternal perspective, all suffering is necessarily viewed as unfair, unreasonable, and unjust. As men and women who embrace the Catholic faith or another faith perspective, we know that we cannot minimize or neglect reason or science in our pursuit of good for patients. For us, however, as believers in Jesus, that reason will and must always be tempered by and subject to faith. As we face difficult situations and circumstances, we need to hear the words of faith which give answers which surpass time and space, reason and science. In those instances where faith and reason seem to be in conflict, then provided we truly know our faith, we become convinced that it is reason and not faith which is involved in error. How quick we are to see the church's perspective, or the world is to see the church's perspective as somehow misguided or backward or antiquated. The reality is that faith is a deeper kind of knowledge, a deeper kind of reason. In our subjectivist, relativistic age, which often masquerades as an age of reason, a lot of the things that the world proposes as reasonable are just plain unreasonable. Not soundly based, not based on the nature of the human person. It's tempting to put a lot more faith in science and reason than it is to put faith in God. Yet both, in many ways, are acts of faith. And both are directed toward a perceived God. For much of our society, that God is science or government or technology. For us, there is a greater God and a greater good. He is the one who stands at the center, at the core of all that we need to do. We are repeatedly, perhaps, challenged to defend our faith perspective against the accusation that if we are people of faith, we cannot be people of science. In truth, we are and must be both. In those instances, and they are many where faith and science agree, then there is no moral or ethical conflict. In those instances where science disagrees with faith or conflicts with the moral code of our church, we must be men and women of faith. In the judgment of some, this will be foolish, ridiculous, or even stupid. But we need to stand firm in faith, which gives us a way of knowing beyond reason and beyond science. We have to witness to that faith in the marketplace, as your presence here attests that you are willing to do and that you are, in fact, already doing. Third, the church understands and stands for true compassion, as defined and explained by Pope Benedict. We heard Pope Benedict's word, a society unable to accept its suffering members and incapable of helping them to share their suffering and to bear it inwardly through compassion is a cruel and inhumane society. While the provision of healthcare insurance to the uninsured or underinsured may stem from compassion, it is also entirely possible that compassion, or as Pope Benedict emphasizes, compassion, is entirely absent from the equation. If we use this statement of Pope Benedict as a benchmark for compassion, then we must ask how our society not only provides for, but accepts its suffering members, how it helps to share their suffering, and how well we suffer with or compassion with our distressed brothers and sisters. The provision of health insurance offers some hope of relief from pain, but there is nothing in it which encourages genuine compassion. In fact, it is very likely that while increasing ease of access to health care for those who suffer, access to compassion may at the same time be diminished. There's a conflict in that. To do the right thing for the wrong reason, or to try to do something good, failing to recognize the dignity of the person for whom it is being done. The further erosion of the patient-physician relationship with the insurer or the government standing as the gatekeeper between them does violence to our Catholic sensibilities and practically impedes compassion, almost forbids it. Little anecdote, there's a man in our office who has some sort of spurs on his vertebrae in his neck and has been in excruciating pain for the last 3 weeks. Keeps going to the doctor, and the doctor says, if it was up to me, I would do surgery. But we have to go through these other steps to try other things before we can get to that which, in my opinion, is what we need to do. So he's going through all of these additional steps, and there may be some justification for that. But in terms of his ability to make a decision about his health care with his physician, it's absolutely missing. People who have never seen this man are making the decisions for what his treatment ought to be. That's not a compassionate model. It may be effective, it may be economically prudent, it may be sustainable, but it doesn't look very compassionate from the standpoint of the patient. The Holy Father reminds us of the words of St. Bernard, who observed, God cannot suffer, but he can suffer with. The Holy Father then adds, God is truth and love in person, and he wanted to suffer for us and with us. He became man so that he could suffer with man in a real way, in flesh and blood. To every human suffering, therefore, there has entered one who shares that suffering and endurance. Thus, in all suffering, because Christ has already entered into it, consolation is present. The consolation of God's participating love is mixed with all suffering so as to give cause for hope and even joy. He continues, without a doubt, pain and suffering always challenge faith. It was true for the apostles, and it is true for us. The Holy Father notes that the wounds of Christ himself become a test for the faith of the disciples and for our faith. They wanted to have Christ avoid the cross, avoid the suffering, avoid the pain. Do not go to Jerusalem. Every time that the Lord speaks about his passion and death, they do not understand, they reject it, they oppose it. For them, as for us, suffering is always charged with mystery, difficult to accept and to bear. The two men of Emmaus walked sadly because of the events that had taken place in those days in Jerusalem, and only when the risen one walks along the road with them do they open up to a new vision. Even the Apostle Thomas manifests the difficulty of believing in the way of redemptive suffering or passion. Unless I see the mark of the nails and put my finger in the mark of the nails and put my hand into his side, I still will not believe. But before Christ, who shows his wounds, his response is transformed into a moving profession of faith. Really, in all of the scriptures, the most profound statement of faith. A statement of personal relationship with Christ, a claiming of him as a personal Redeemer, my Lord and my God. A beautiful, intimate affiliation with Christ, because he saw in the wounds of Christ the depth of Christ's love for him. Our suffering brothers and sisters likewise need to see the wounds of Christ so that they do not forget that he loves them and that their suffering is a participation in his own. What was that first and insurmountable obstacle that crossed those wounds of Christ, because it was a sign of Jesus' apparent failure, becomes in the encounter with the risen one proof of victorious love. Only a God who loves us to the extent of taking upon himself our wounds and our pain, especially innocent suffering, is worthy of faith. The Holy Father continues and reminds us it is precisely through the wounds of Christ that we are able to see with the eyes of hope all the evils that afflict humanity. See, in our secular perspective, there's no possibility of them looking at any suffering and finding any ability to comprehend, understand, accept, or to enter into it as somehow sharing in God's love for them. In rising again, the Lord did not remove suffering and evil from the world. And there's somehow a perspective that that's the mission of the church now, to remove suffering and evil from the world. No. But what he does is that he defeats them at the root, and that's what we must do in the healthcare industry, in the healthcare ministry, to get to the root of all of these things. He opposed the arrogance of evil and with the omnipotence of his love. He has shown us, therefore, that the way of peace and joy is love. While with St. Thomas, we also need to say, my Lord and my God. The Holy Father challenges the healthcare professionals. Let us follow our Master in readiness to spend our lives for our brothers and sisters, becoming messengers of a joy that does not fear pain, the joy of resurrection. The answer of the Holy Father, while not necessarily applicable to public policy, nonetheless must remain an integral part of Catholic healthcare policy and the providing of healthcare by Catholic institutions. That message of hope beyond the pain, beyond the suffering, but not a hope only of physical well-being, but a hope ultimately in eternal life. That is the hope, as the Holy Father points out so beautifully in Spe Salvi. That is the hope which can sustain us, and the only hope, ultimately, that can sustain us. Fourth, the Church brings to the table, and a very, very important point, a philosophy of the human person which drives and determines our approach to a suffering patient. It's absolutely essential to approach healthcare with a proper anthropology. Last year, the Catholic Medical Association held its national conference in Seattle, and that was literally the theme. What is our anthropology out of which our provision of healthcare flows? What is the anthropology of the present healthcare bill on a national basis? The anthropology is very shallow and very, very weak. In fact, it's embarrassing. If man is viewed only as a rational creature with no eternal longing or possibility, then healthcare becomes a question of plumbing or mechanics. Physicians become exalted veterinarians. If man is no different than the other animals, what is the difference? Insurance becomes a bill-paying mechanism. On the other hand, if man is viewed as a beloved creature of God with innate worth and dignity, then healthcare is a sacred trust. Physicians engage in a sacred ministry. Insurance becomes a means of assuring dignified treatment for all. It's quite easy to get caught up in doing something ostensibly good while forgetting the underlying and sacred why, which renders what we do truly good. This ecclesial perspective helps assure that what is offered as covered services can truly be considered health care. There may be a perception that Catholic healthcare provides only a restricted set of services, but the reality is that Catholic healthcare offers all that is consistent with the proper understanding of the nature and dignity of the human person. Unfortunately, the area subject to the most serious misunderstanding of human dignity, namely man's sexual dignity, is one major area where secular healthcare misses the mark. Another is respect for life in general, whether at the beginning or at the end of life. In this area, a faulty anthropology leads to disastrous results. Catholic providers of healthcare cannot engage in any of these activities without imperiling their own eternal salvation. We sometimes hear the argument that Catholic healthcare facilities need to offer all of the same, quote, services, end quote, as their secular counterparts. This view sees only the patient as the one who has rights, and rights not based on the nature of the human person, but rather on arbitrary laws. These same laws may soon disregard the Catholic institution's right and indeed duty, as well as that of the individual physician, to observe a well-defined moral code based on the nature of the human person. The efforts of members of the House and Senate to assure continued and even expanded conscience right protection for institutions and individuals is critical, not only for Catholic healthcare institutions, but critical for healthcare in America as well, if we are to preserve compassion and to be a consoling, healing ministry. Health insurance, too, can operate out of a defective anthropology, and the Church's vision needs to influence this arena as well. Consider health insurance that covers by state mandate contraception or abortion, but which does not mandate coverage for family counseling. It's a challenge to take a look at the provisions of whatever health care plan you are in and to read all of the plan. And I read just this morning the Samaritan plan, and does many, many wonderful things. And my remarks are not intended to be critical of them, but there's a couple of areas that I would ask us to look at as Catholic healthcare professionals and providers, and thinkers in this field, to think about what does this exclusion or inclusion mean. Consider a plan which excludes coverage for a dependent child who attempts suicide. Think about it from a faith perspective. A family, part of our Catholic family, has a child who, for whatever reason, inflicts harm on themselves. Health insurance says, no, that's not covered. At that time, when that family is in most desperate need, they find that insurance does not provide for them. Is that a time for compassion to outweigh some sort of statement about, well, it's not proper for us to cover self-inflicted wounds? It seems to me that as a Catholic community, as a Christian community, it's the last moment in which you would want to say, no, I'm sorry, that's not covered. In those moments, Catholic healthcare needs to be there for that family at a time of perhaps the greatest suffering that they could experience. No one, as far as I know, inflicts harm on themselves for the sake of bilking the healthcare industry. I mean, it could happen, but it's not a typical mode of operation. It operates out of some other act of desperation. Those are cries for help. And the response of a compassionate policy would be, we need to be there for that person and for that family at that time. Many plans include coverage for sterilization, but do not include coverage for sterilization reversal. Again, The desire for reversal surgeries would be rare, but a plan consistent with the Catholic ethic of forgiveness and healing would see such a surgery as fully consistent with Catholic values and principles. If it's excluded, why? Granted, it's a cost, but it's a relatively rare kind of thing. It's not enormously expensive. It's not going to be the procedure which is going to bankrupt a healthcare plan. Should we look at that and ask, should it be included? Many plans cover all sorts of contraceptive devices, but very few cover the costs of training or utilization of natural family planning. Plans which I have reviewed consistently deny coverage for treatment of infertility, and as far as most in vitro style of infertility treatments, this is certainly fine. But a Catholic plan could and perhaps should make an accommodation for the utilization of a plan or program of infertility treatment consistent with Catholic ethics. Something that needs to be thought about, and plans need to be looked at and asked, if this would happen, would we want this to be covered? The whole field of the transplantation of non-paired vital organs needs to be carefully reviewed and more carefully regulated. The Church approves of the transplantation of organs with the caveat that donors of vital organs are truly dead. The concept of brain death has always been viewed with skepticism by some, and more recent studies have given even greater cause to question the validity of this method of determining death. Vital organs may not be removed from a patient whose death is very much a matter of conjecture. People who have serious brain injuries are still to be considered patients and should not cross over into the line of being considered donors until there is a high degree, if not absolute certainty, that they are dead. And that's not the standard that we operate out of. The Catholic Church certainly affirms and believes in the value of family, and present HIPAA regulations often separate children from the parents when it comes to health care, and not all health care, but that health care which touches sexual behaviors. This is not something that a health care plan can affect, but when a plan refuses to provide coverage for products necessary for promiscuity, that plan indirectly supports parents in their desire to choose good things for their children. I think that one of the things we tend to lose sight of today in modern medicine is that the Church is not an opponent to health care, but rather its best and most consistent proponent. Our approach, however, is not willing to accept any vague concept of what constitutes health care, but will accept and foster only that which is consistent with the best good of the entire person, as well as the global common good of all. Often the Passion, the cross of Jesus, generate fear because they seem to be a negation of life. In reality, it's exactly the contrary. The cross is God's yes to mankind, the highest and most intense expression of his love, and the source from which flows eternal life. From the pierced heart of Jesus, this divine life flowed. He alone is capable of liberating the world from evil and making his kingdom of justice, peace, and love present, to which we all aspire. Together with him, may the Virgin Mary, whom we invoke with trust as the health of the sick and consoler of the suffering, keep watch at your side. At the foot of the cross, the prophecy of Simeon was fulfilled for her. Her heart as a mother was pierced. From the depths of her pain, a participation in that of her Son, Mary is made capable of accepting the new mission to become the mother of Christ in its members. At the hour of the cross, Jesus presents to her each of his disciples, each of us, saying, "Woman, behold your son." Her maternal compassion for the Son becomes maternal compassion for each of the daily sufferings of our brothers and sisters. She is, in many ways, perhaps the heart of health care which flows through your hands, through your efforts, from the church to the world. In all of the work that we do, in the faces of the sick, on whose your efforts are really directed, the Holy Father says, may you see always that face of faces, always the face of Christ. I commend you and thank you for all the good that you are doing, and pray that our efforts bear fruit. And if we do not sense that they bear fruit here and now, we can trust that if we do so faithfully, they will bear fruit in eternity. God bless all of you.